I was most amused by the particular subjects that seem to have excited the imagination and outrage of the two of you. I'll just list them before I go in my last 19 seconds. Donald Trump's relationship with Russia, the Canadian truckers, ivermectin, Jordan Peterson, and then something about this thing in... These aren't things driven by the mainstream media. These are obsessions of the non-mainstream media.
Are you really saying that Trump's relationship with Russia wasn't not an obsession of mainstream media? It was basically the entire content of cable news for 3 years.
What's going on, everybody? In today's video, authors Douglas Murray and Matt Taibbi debate woke liberal elites Malcolm Gladwell and Michelle Goldberg about whether or not the mainstream media can be trusted. Matt Taibbi and Douglas Murray provide mountains of hard evidence that legacy news media cannot be trusted, while their opponents do their best to minimize their points by changing the subject or ignoring them altogether. Why anyone would defend the mainstream media is beyond me, and you'll see why when we watch this clip of Douglas Murray and Matt Taibbi destroying these woke leftist lunatics. Let's take a look.
And the entire, basically, mainstream media spent years following a fake story about Donald Trump being in league with Vladimir Putin to fix the 2016 election. It was a wrong story. We have a leaked audio tape that was published in Slate.com where the editor of the New York Times says, well, they got caught a little flat-footed on that one because, our readers who want Donald Trump to go away are going to be disappointed about this. He says, we built our entire newsroom around one story, and they got it wrong. There's no way to defend that kind of inaccuracy, and it only happens if everybody wants so badly for it to be true that they overlook all the guardrails that are in place. No serious journalist that I know looked at that story and didn't have qualms about it. Yes, there are processes in place, and there was once an ethos in place, but that ethos is gone now. And maybe the processes remain, but there are too many errors proving otherwise.
Sorry for pausing so quickly, but I need to give some context for the next part of this video. This debate was really long, so I had to break it up. So now we're going to look at Malcolm Gladwell's response to Matt Taibbi, where he references Walter Cronkite. This is relevant because Taibbi mentioned Cronkite to highlight a different era of journalism when Cronkite was considered the most trusted man in America, contrasting that with today when significantly more than half the country doesn't trust the media. Anyway, back to it.
I was greatly amused by the affection Matt Taibbi has for the age of Walter Cronkite, which he seemed to hold up as a kind of golden moment. In that moment, the mainstream media was populated entirely by white men from elite schools. Why you would have had such affection and say that's the gold standard, and we should trust the mainstream media precisely at the moment when the mainstream media is least representative, is really puzzling to me. I would point out that at the height of Walter Cronkite's reign in American media, neither people like Michelle and I wouldn't have been on the stage, right? We weren't part of the conversation. So I don't know why we should hold such a kind of affection for that moment. I was also struck by the contradictions between the comments that both of you made. When Douglas said that he was very upset at the way the Canadian media acted as an amen chorus of the Canadian government with respect to the truckers, I would just point out that the reason Walter Cronkite was so beloved by people like Matt Taibbi's father and grandfather is that he was an amen chorus for the United States government. So the two of you should really get together in the next 5 minutes and work out your story. One last comment, and that is I was most amused by the particular subjects that seem to have excited the imagination and outrage of the two of you. I'll just list them before I go in my last 19 seconds. Donald Trump's relationship with Russia, the Canadian truckers, ivermectin, Jordan Peterson, and then something about this thing in... These aren't things driven by the mainstream media. These are obsessions of the non-mainstream media. Once again, work it out, guys.
First of all, are you really saying that Trump's relationship with Russia wasn't not an obsession of mainstream media? It was basically the entire content of cable news for 3 years. There was almost, again, the editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, said, we built our newsroom around one story, that story. The New York Times doesn't get much more mainstream than that, I don't think.
Malcolm, you did a little nasty jab there, I noticed, at Matt, by trying to pretend that Matt Taibbi is desperate for the era of white men in broadcasting.
If you like videos like this one, please like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Let's get back to the video.
Takes a certain chutzpah to make that claim, but I don't see any reason why that is the case with Matt. I don't think that you are hankering desperately for a world of white news presenters. We've only just met, but you didn't give off that vibe to me. And when Malcolm says you've got to get your story right, guys, I know it's easy for a cheap laugh line, but I don't see why we do. We're two very different people with very different careers, interests, and much more. We've trodden very different paths across very wide swathes of this planet. And we don't need to get our story straight for you, or for this audience tonight, or be in lockstep. Differences of opinion, including on the same side, used to be cherished.
I was astonished to listen as Matt Taibbi doubled down on his defense of Walter Cronkite. I feel like there should be a giant picture of Walter Cronkite behind. And he said, the most incredible quote was, Walter Cronkite, the era of that era in journalism was distinguished by journalists, quote, making the effort to talk to everybody. Now, he's talking about the 1950s and 60s. I just wanted to make a short list of the people who were not spoken to by journalists in the 1950s and 60s. And you may want to add some, if I miss some, black people, women, poor people, gay people, people with mildly left-wing views. I mean, words fail me when somebody, when it presented with a critique of his rather idiosyncratic position on Walter Cronkite, comes back and says, oh, no, there's more to my great love of this man.
And so, yes, there are processes. Fact-checking is important. I do it. I hire fact-checkers to do it. But this is not the standard process for all mainstream media institutions anymore. We don't do it as much as we used to. Part of that is for financial reasons.
Wait, I can't sit here and let you make these statements that without any kind of, we don't do that as much as we used to for financial reasons. I mean, I worked at the New Yorker. The New Yorker, if anything, spends more money on fact-checking today than it did in the past. I would have thought, with my first book, I didn't hire a fact-checker, but then I observed the number of errors in it. I also observed that the nature of the journalism world in which we live, the scrutiny of journalists is such that it's really perilous not to have a fact-checker, and so now I have fact-checkers. Many other people, I think, have observed the same thing, that there is now so much attention paid to the accuracy of things that writers say that you'd better make sure you don't have errors in your. So, I mean, Matt, I understand that you do have this wonderful nostalgia for the way things used to be, but I think that you need to fact-check some of your nostalgic notions about the wonderful world of the 1950s. Who was watchdogging the New York Times in the 1950s? Nobody was. It was a tiny little universe of people now watchdog institutions like that, and so they have a higher commitment to the truth.
So first of all,
hold on, Matt. Let's bring Douglas in on this. I just want to hear his voice.
Doug is speechless.
I'm never speechless.
Right. So Douglas Murray is literally about to massacre Malcolm Gladwell, but there's so much to unpack here. I had to stop and comment at some point. So predictable so far, right? Malcolm Gladwell completely ignores the topic at hand and immediately pivots to identity politics, veering away from the topic. Instead, he smears Matt Taibbi as a racist, homophobe, and misogynist. Sound familiar? Like every conversation with a leftist these days and how it devolves into those topics, this debate is a perfect microcosm of today's media landscape versus the people who've woken up to its lies. Now, you heard there, Gladwell ended his rebuttal by saying something to the effect of, "Get your story straight." Ironically, this phrase reveals so much. It shows how deeply ingrained the idea of keeping the narrative straight is to him and his allies in mainstream media. It is so telling of his bias and the lengths he'll go to defend the media status quo. Then at one point, Gladwell claims that conspiracy theories aren't driven by the mainstream media, but by non-mainstream outlets. Are you serious? If we were to compile all the mainstream stories on the topics he dismisses, we'd be here for weeks, if not months. One more thing before we get back to the video. I don't know if you caught it, but he mispronounced Matt Taibbi's name. This is literally part of his strategy during this debate. He does it to both of them. See if you catch it, but it is pathetic, man. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
It's not a problem I suffer from. I can't sit here and listen to Malcolm Gladwell talking about fact-checking and the importance of it. Not to get too mean, Malcolm. I read your book, David and Goliath. The chapter on Northern Ireland is more filled with inaccuracies than any other chapter in a non-fiction book I have read. It is, having written a not very well selling, but widely acclaimed book on Northern Ireland myself, my book on Northern Ireland didn't sell anywhere near as much as yours did, Malcolm. But mine was filled with facts. And
Well, now.
your chapter on Northern Ireland was so filled with inaccuracies. Irish historians ripped it apart. Would that you had a fact checker, Malcolm. Would that you did your own research. But anyway, let me get back to another point.
I must say, you do a very good job of it. But you must say, you do have a tendency to accuse those who disagree with your opinions.
No, it's not disagreement.
It's
not disagreement, Malcolm. You didn't know that the provisional IRA were responsible for 60% of the deaths in the Troubles. There were basic things you just didn't know, Malcolm. No. I'm sorry, it's not my fault, it's yours and your fact checkers.
I didn't know that the function of this debate was to rehash the accuracy of a chapter in a book.
Well, you were the one that started talking about fact checkers. I'm simply saying, why don't you employ some?
I suspect
or your publishers.
Douglas,
why don't I make the point I wanted to make other than that?
Briefly, yes. Good Lord.
So take the Hunter Biden story.
Oh, here we go. I'm sorry.
Of course you don't want to hear it.
Is there no end to the kind of Twitter stuff you guys are going to dredge up?
Of course you don't want to hear it, Malcolm. Of course you wouldn't, because it goes against your ideological presumptions. That story was a big story, okay? It was a big story. The New York Post, which I write for, but the New York Post, America's oldest newspaper, was silenced on Twitter, was silenced across the media. You know, the Washington Post has now picked it up. It's saying that, yeah, the laptop's true. But why didn't the media pick it up before? Why didn't they call up people? Why didn't they check whether the emails were accurate? Because they didn't want Biden to lose the election. He was their guy. And they weren't going to screw that up. Now, I ask you...
Can I respond to that? Not only that. This is an important allegation, and I knew that Hunter Biden laptop was going to come up. It had to land, so it's landed at just the right time. So, Michelle, let's come to you on this, because I think many people...
I do want to talk about the Hunter Biden laptop, because I actually was telling Malcolm, we were talking this morning, and I said, I bet they're going to want to talk about the Hunter Biden laptop. And he said to me, really? Who would care about that?
Yeah,
but I want to say this about the Hunter Biden laptop, because again, I feel like this story is this is a revisionist history. I mean, let's remember what happened with the Hunter Biden laptop. The person who wrote the New York Post story asked to have their name taken off of it because they thought the story was unreliable. The people who had the hard drive would not give it to the Washington Post and the New York Times before the election. So you're basically saying, why didn't they rely on the Post reporting that the reporter himself considered unreliable? And I went back through some of this stuff because I figured we'd be talking about this. The Washington Post, yes, has been able to confirm they hired forensic experts, were able to confirm some of the emails on the Hunter Biden laptop and some of the other material. There's I don't think anyone's disputing that Hunter Biden is both corrupt and troubled person. But I just want to, I wrote this down because I thought this might come up. Among the reasons for the inconclusive findings was the sloppy handling of the data, which damaged some records. The experts found that the data had been repeatedly accessed and copied by people other than Hunter Biden over nearly 3 years, blah, 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 the FBI. The security experts who examined the data for the Post struggled to reach definitive conclusions about the contents as a whole, including whether all of it originated from a single computer or could have been assembled from files from multiple computers and put on the portable drive. So the media has covered this, but they have also been, I think, careful, given the fact that this stuff still cannot be authenticated. And I spoke at the very beginning about the media kind of trying to self-correct, sometimes to a fault.
Malcolm, you're kind of, oh my God, what a yawnaroo the whole Hunter Biden story is. How boring to talk about the idea of corruption at an epic scale in the first family. How boring. Who would want to harp on about that? Let me try the counterfactual on you. It's October 2020. And a huge number of emails are suddenly dumped, revealing unbelievable scandal in the Trump family. I don't want to concentrate on the dick pics and the crack and the stuff. Never mind about Don Jr. if he'd been doing that. Let's just focus on the emails. There was a very easy way, Michelle, as you know, to certify whether this stuff was true. You could call up anyone on the email chains and say, did you get this email? They didn't bother with any of that stuff. They'd have been excited as hell across most of the mainstream media if this had been emails from Donald Trump's son saying, and I'm no Trump fan, let's not get into that cheap rut, but if it had been Don Jr. saying to his child, you've no idea what I've done for this family, the demeaning things I've gone through, I have to give half of everything I earn to my dad. Oh, you're Nauru, definitely. Who'd care about that? No, the point is simply that this was one of the occasions in recent years where the mainstream media showed its transparency as a political organization. That's why we care.
Okay. Well, you know, I was struck once again in listening to our opponents by how much their arguments resemble the kind of classic structure of a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy theory is a theory in which one assumes a degree of unanimity and collaboration amongst one's foes, right? The conspiracist speaks of those who disagree with himself or herself as if they had a single voice. And there are numerous really unpleasant examples of this. This is not one of those. This is a much milder, more naive variant on the traditional conspiratorial model. But nonetheless, when Matt and Doug speak about the mainstream media, they're acting as if there's a big room, possibly in New York or in Washington, D.C., or maybe in between, so that each party has equal access to the room, in which everyone gathers every morning and makes up the agenda for the day, right? And the people fly in from the big news networks, and someone from CBC comes down, and this cabal of high-minded, well-paid, elite white, as it turns out, journalists, some of them, the ones that Matt seems to have such affection for, gather together and set the agenda for the country. Now,
it's so strange hearing you debate, Malcolm, because you listen to nothing that your opponents say. It's quite extraordinary. I've met it before, but never quite so badly as it occurs in you. You keep saying things that neither of us have said, and then you try to pathologize what we say. You decide to say things like, oh, it's a conspiracy theory. If it comes from this side, it's a conspiracy theory. You say, we don't do our research. We're just conspiracy theorists. Apparently mild dose of it, he says, in his excellent medical-like analysis of his opponents. We just have a mild dose. No, Malcolm, why don't you listen to what comes out of our mouths and try to learn something from it, as I am with you this evening? But at the moment, all I get is you dismissing every single story we come up with, every egregious failure of the mainstream media. I've given you a definition of what I think of as the mainstream media, so your attempt to claim that we haven't answered it yet is just another straw man in your massive legion of straw men you keep creating this evening. But I beg you to actually consider the fact that what we are describing is, even if you think not as accurate as you would like, an expression of a problem that is going on in our societies. Functioning liberal democracies need to have trust in their media. And the best that your side has been able to come up with so far tonight is to say, we get things wrong quite often, but you should trust us.
There's no shortcut to trust in media. The only way to get it is by doing a good job over and over and over again, not getting things wrong, and when you do get things wrong, admitting it. There's no other way to do it in media. And the mainstream media, what we're talking about tonight, has repeatedly gotten things wrong, not admitted it, not owned up to it. I mean, Malcolm is talking about conspiracy theories. Let's talk about a story that was huge in America for years. This idea that Donald Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, was making visits to Prague. Now, this came from the infamous Steele dossier. If you read the dossier, basically the idea is Trump sent his lawyer to go meet with hackers and Kremlin representatives in Prague. And Steele says that they would preferably be Romanian hackers who would afterwards retreat to Bulgaria, where they could use that country as a bolt hole to lie low. If that's not a conspiracy theory, I don't know what is. This story was taken seriously by every major news organization in America for years on end with no evidence. And he accuses us of being conspiracy theorists. It's preposterous.
Well, that take on the Hunter Biden laptop aged pretty well, huh? And I'm sorry, I have to say this, and it's the only ad hominem I'll throw around this whole video, but anybody that says assumes, like Malcolm Gladwell did, assumes, has to be an oh, it's so pretentious and awful. Anyway, so unsurprisingly, Gladwell brings up racism, sexism, and homophobia again. I think it's the third or fourth time. Demonizing white men. This is his main argument. Is that all he prepared for this debate? How about addressing just one of the stories or one of the points that Taibbi and Douglas are making? And as Douglas Murray points out, many so-called conspiracy theories have come true. At this point, it's astounding that anyone wouldn't be at least somewhat skeptical of mainstream news. And yet, so many Americans still take everything they're told at face value. So let me get this straight. Gladwell and Goldberg prepared copious notes to discuss the Hunter Biden laptop story, this little story he claims that no one would care about. If it was so insignificant, why come prepared to talk about it? And I have to reiterate exactly what Douglas Murray said. Would they have been as careful, they being the media, if Donald Trump and his family were the subjects of a similar story? Murray makes an excellent point. They didn't even need professional fact checkers for that story. They could have just reached out to people on the email chain, but apparently that was too much to ask. You know, and I have to say, I think the fact that Douglas Murray isn't a Trump supporter, that lends even more credibility to his already outstanding case for distrusting mainstream media. And on the other hand, Malcolm Gladwell lost his credibility about a minute into the debate. And he just keeps digging the hole deeper and deeper with every single word he speaks. So as far as I can see it, it feels like the foundation of Gladwell's strategy is to filibuster, to run out the clock. And, of course, to act like everything his opponents say is absurd. And when I say filibuster, I'm talking about how he compares the points they're making or the stories they're bringing up to unrelated hypotheticals. And before you know it, time's up. I mean, Douglas already said it, but he listens to nothing they say. You know, Douglas calls him out for kind of having this elitist attitude and suggesting that liberal elite media, mainstream media, we know what's best for you, but you don't do your own research. Essentially, they think you and I are morons. And they're saying to you, let us educated elites tell you what you need to know. In other words, the rest of us must be spouting conspiracy theories if we have any ideas that are our own. All right, we're in the home stretch here. Just a few minutes to go, and I'll make a couple comments at the end, and we'll wrap this thing up. All right, let's get back to it.
Here's what I think the debate boils down to, and that is that our opponents believe that the mainstream media they're concerned that the mainstream media, to the extent that they have told us what it is filled with people who don't think like they do, and that fact makes them uncomfortable. And in support of this, they have given us a long list of rather predictable hot-button topics taken from their Twitter feed. And my question was, what would make them happy? So what would restore the trust of Matt and Doug in the mainstream media? And I think with Matt, the answer is obviously he would like, it was the...
Sorry to pause, but did you catch that? I mentioned it earlier that he keeps mispronouncing their names or saying it incorrectly. There's about to be a payoff here, so pay attention.
The world resembled 1955 again. That would fill him with joy. Doug would like more stories on the Hunter Biden laptop.
4 times you're going to play the race
card? But more
card?
seriously,
Really?
Well, Malk, I'm going to try to take this more seriously than you did in your endless creation of straw men, which just is ceaseless this evening, and address what I think is the real problem we have in our century in terms of information technology. Having different opinions is so 20th century. This century, we have different facts, and it's lethal. It's absolutely lethal for the functioning of society. And if you want to see how lethal it is, look at the situation in America, where not just the media, but every institution, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the Supreme Court, every institution, you decide whether it's for your side or not. It's disastrous for society. But it starts with the facts. And when the facts go wrong, or you become glib about them, or decide that it's just the facts that will suit your side, or pretend you're playing a game of honesty and are not actually playing a game of honesty, everything else in the society can go to hell. This side has not been saying any of these straw men that you've been so kindly creating this evening, Malcolm. We've been saying that the mainstream media cannot be trusted. That is all. We're not saying don't read it. I repeat, we're not saying don't absorb it. Of course, you'd be an idiot to say that. What, you think we're only going to read Substacks for the rest of life? There's not even time. But the mainstream media is currently failing. It is failing you, the public. It is failing its employees. It's failing at its central task. You quoted one example of what journalism was meant to consist of. I would quote another, what George Orwell said. It's out on his statue outside the BBC. Sadly, the employees do not read it every morning before going in. But George Orwell famously said that the job of a journalist was to tell people facts they don't want to hear. The problem we have in our century coming up is that people will be paying for and absorbing only the facts they want to hear. The argument we are making is one of hygiene, basic hygiene in the media, in the mainstream media. I don't want to blow it up. I don't want an end to it or anything like it. I spent a significant amount of my life in the mainstream media. We just want it to be honest. We just want it to be factual. We don't want it to chase its own prejudices. We just want it to speak truth, whatever that is. That's not so radical.
I'm going to wrap up, but I want to go back to one thing I forgot to mention earlier in the discussion. At one point, Malcolm Gladwell interrupts Matt Taibbi and calls him crazy for suggesting that fact-checking isn't as robust today, and suggested partly for financial reasons. But isn't it interesting, think about this, that misinformation, disinformation, and fact-checking have become buzzwords in mainstream media, especially when, over the last 8 years, it was designed as a tool to discredit Donald Trump and his allies. My issue with fact-checking is simple. Who decides who gets checked? And who determines what facts are? Any bias, and we're human beings, we all have it, will skew the facts in one direction or another. That's really dangerous. As we wrap up this video, I've got to say Matt Taibbi and especially Douglas Murray perfectly articulated why so many Americans don't trust the mainstream media. I, for one, will continue to interpret news to the best of my ability based on the facts that are available. And I hope you will too. Don't be a sheep. Hey, if you enjoy watching woke idiots like Malcolm Gladwell get owned as much as I do, then click on one of the videos that's on your screen or about to pop up on your screen. Really appreciate you joining us today. We'll see you on the next one.